there are mysteries. And then there are mysteries that seem almost impossible to believe, not because they involve magic, not because they belong to mythology, but because they exist in the real world, waiting for an answer that never comes. For more than 600 years, a single object has challenged historians, linguists, cryptographers, and some of the brightest researchers alive. Not a lost city, not a hidden treasure, a book, an ordinary-looking book. Its cover reveals nothing. Its pages look fragile. Its ink has faded with time. If you walked past it inside a museum, you probably wouldn't stop for more than a few seconds. And yet, behind those pages lies one of history's greatest unanswered questions, because no one can tell you, with complete certainty, what the book actually says. The strange part isn't that people haven't tried. They have, for generations. Experts from different countries, different languages, different fields of science, have all stared at the same pages, searching for a single breakthrough, one sentence, one paragraph, anything that could finally unlock its secret. But every promising discovery eventually collapsed. Every confident theory created even more questions. The deeper researchers looked, the less they understood, and that's what makes this mystery different. Most historical puzzles become smaller as evidence grows. This one became larger. Imagine spending years studying something, only to realize you understand it less today than you did yesterday. That is exactly what happened to the people who dedicated their lives to this manuscript. Some believed it recorded forgotten medical knowledge. Others claimed it was an encrypted scientific journal. A few argued it was nothing more than an elaborate medieval fraud. Each theory sounded convincing, until it met the next unanswered question. The manuscript refused to fit into any explanation. It was too structured to be random, too consistent to be an accident, too mysterious to ignore. Then, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Researchers stopped asking, "What does it mean?" Instead, they asked a much simpler question. What if we've been looking at it the wrong way all along? That single change would transform the investigation forever, because before anyone could understand the words, they first needed to answer another question, a question hidden not in the ink, but in the pages themselves. And the answer would surprise everyone. The first mistake people make is assuming the mystery began in 1912. It didn't. That was simply the moment the world noticed it. The story had already been unfolding for centuries. When Wilfred Voynich discovered the manuscript inside a Jesuit college near Rome, he wasn't searching for history's greatest mystery. He was searching for rare books. The manuscript looked ordinary. No jeweled cover, no famous author's name, no sign that it belonged among history's greatest treasures. If anything, it looked forgotten. But experienced book dealers learn one lesson very quickly. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries hide inside the plainest covers. Voynich opened the first page. The handwriting was unlike anything he had seen before, not because it was messy, quite the opposite. It was beautiful, carefully spaced, consistent. Every line flowed with confidence. Whoever had written these pages never seemed to hesitate. That detail would later become incredibly important, because fake languages usually fall apart. Random symbols become inconsistent. Patterns disappear. Mistakes multiply. The Voynich manuscript did the opposite. The writing remained disciplined. Page after page, chapter after chapter, almost as if the author wasn't inventing the language, but using one they already knew. That single observation changed everything. Because if the language was real, then someone, somewhere, had once been able to read it. But who? And why has no second example ever been found? Researchers searched libraries across Europe, private collections, church archives, royal records. They hoped another manuscript would appear. Another letter, another diary. Anything written using the same strange alphabet. Nothing. Not one confirmed document. Imagine discovering an English novel. Only to learn every other English book had vanished forever. How would anyone learn the language? That's the impossible situation researchers found themselves in. They possessed the book, but not the key. Then something even stranger caught their attention. The manuscript wasn't filled with random drawings. Its pages seemed divided into sections. One section focused on plants, another on astronomy, another showed mysterious women surrounded by flowing green pools. Another contained circular diagrams that looked almost mechanical. It felt organized, purposeful, like chapters in a textbook. But a textbook for whom? And written by whom? The deeper scholars looked. The more, one uncomfortable possibility emerged. Maybe the author never intended ordinary people to read it. Maybe secrecy wasn't a side effect. Maybe secrecy was the entire purpose. History offers examples of hidden knowledge. Kings encrypted military messages. Scientists protected discoveries. Alchemists disguised their work behind symbols only other alchemists understood. Could this manuscript belong to that tradition? Or were researchers amateurs trying to force a familiar explanation onto something completely unique? Every answer seemed reasonable, until another page destroyed it. The investigation had reached a dead end, and then science stepped in. Not to study the ink, not to translate the words, but to answer a much simpler question. How old? Was the book itself? For decades, researchers argued over the same question. Was the Voynich Manuscript genuine? Or was it one of history's most elaborate frauds? The debate never seemed to end. Supporters of the manuscript believed it preserved knowledge from the Middle Ages. Skeptics believed someone had created an elaborate fake to fool wealthy collectors. And honestly, both sides had convincing arguments. The drawings looked strange. The language was unknown. No author could be confirmed. No one could even explain why the book existed. It was the perfect environment for doubt. Then, a group of scientists suggested something surprisingly simple. Forget the writing. Forget the drawings. Let's find out when the pages themselves were made. It sounded almost too obvious. But sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs begin with the smallest questions. A tiny sample of the parchment was carefully removed. Not enough to damage the manuscript. Just enough for testing. The pages were sent for radiocarbon dating. Researchers waited. If the parchment turned out to be modern, the mystery would end overnight. The manuscript would be exposed as a forgery. One laboratory result would erase an entire century of speculation. But that's not what happened. The results shocked everyone. The parchment wasn't modern. It wasn't even close. The animal skin used to create the pages dated back to the early 1400s, between 1404 and 1438. For the first time, scientists had something they could say with confidence. The manuscript, or at least the pages it was written on, really came from the medieval period. One mystery had finally been solved, but in solving it, researchers accidentally created an even bigger one. Because if someone wanted to create a fake, why would they use parchment that was already centuries old? Even in the 15th century, high-quality parchment was expensive. Making an entire book required the skins of many animals. It wasn't something people wasted. Forgers usually choose the cheapest materials available, not the most valuable. So, if this was a hoax, It was unlike any hoax historians had ever seen. The evidence forced researchers into an uncomfortable position. Maybe they had underestimated the manuscript. Maybe they weren't looking at a clever fake. Maybe they were looking at something genuine, something whose purpose had simply been forgotten. But the radiocarbon test had one important limitation. It only dated the parchment. Not the ink, not the handwriting, not the moment the words were written. Someone could, in theory, write on old parchment years later. The possibility remained. Small, but impossible to ignore. Once again, the manuscript slipped through humanity's fingers. Every answer came with another question attached, and that pattern would repeat itself again, and again, and again. Researchers returned to the manuscript. This time, they stopped asking when it was written. Instead, they asked a different question. If we can't read the words, what can the words tell us about themselves? The answer would begin with something surprisingly ordinary: patterns. Imagine someone hands you a book. You can't read a single word, but after staring at it for a few minutes, you begin noticing something strange. Certain symbols appear together again, and again, and again. Some words are incredibly short. Others stretch across the page. Some appear only once. Others repeat hundreds of times. That's exactly what researchers noticed. At first, it looked promising. Real languages have patterns. English does, Arabic does, Chinese does. Every language follows invisible rules, and, surprisingly, so did the Voynich Manuscript. The same words appeared in predictable places. Certain symbols almost always followed others. Some combinations never appeared together. It wasn't random. It behaved like a language. That discovery changed everything, because random nonsense doesn't organize itself. Random symbols don't create grammar. Random writing doesn't develop habits. Yet the Voynich Manuscript did. The more researchers analyzed it, the more human it seemed. And that was terrifying, because if this really was a human language, then millions of people had somehow forgotten it. The investigation became even stranger. Researchers counted every symbol, every word, every repeated sequence. Computers compared the manuscript against hundreds of known languages: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Ancient Egyptian, Nahuatl, even extinct languages spoken thousands of years ago. The result? Nothing. Some languages came close for a few pages. Others matched the word frequency. A few matched sentence length. But none matched everything. It was like solving a puzzle, only to discover the pieces belonged to different boxes. Every answer solved one mystery and created another. Then came one of the strangest discoveries of all. Researchers noticed something called Zipf's law. Most people have never heard of it, but almost every language on Earth follows it. In simple terms, a few words are used constantly. Words like the, and, of, while thousands of other words appear only occasionally. English follows this pattern, Spanish follows it, Arabic follows it. Even computer programming languages show similar behavior. And, unbelievably, so did the Voynich Manuscript. That shouldn't have happened. If the manuscript was random, it would fail the test. If it was meaningless, it would fail the test. Instead, it behaved almost exactly like meaningful writing. The discovery shocked many researchers. Maybe, just maybe, someone really was speaking through these pages. We just couldn't understand the language. But then, another team reached a completely different conclusion. They argued a clever person could fake these patterns. Not easily, but it was possible. By repeating symbols carefully, a skilled writer could create the illusion of language. The debate exploded again. Was this evidence, or another trap? Every new study seemed to divide experts into two groups. One side believed they were closer than ever. The other believed they had just walked into another dead end. And somehow, both sides had convincing arguments. The manuscript refused to choose. It stayed perfectly silent, as if it was watching humanity argue over a conversation it had never been invited into. If the writing couldn't give researchers an answer, perhaps the drawings could. And that's when they turned the page to something that looked familiar, until they looked closer. By this point, researchers had spent decades studying the writing, and despite all that effort, they were no closer to reading a single sentence. So they made another decision. If the words refused to speak, perhaps the illustrations would. At first, the drawings looked exactly like what you'd expect to find inside a medieval book. Plants, flowers, roots, leaves, nothing unusual. But then, a botanist looked closer. One leaf belonged to one species. The flower belonged to another. The roots resembled something else entirely. It wasn't one plant, it was three, combined into one impossible illustration. Researchers checked another page, then another, then another. The same thing kept happening. Every plant looked familiar, yet none of them actually existed. It was one of the strangest discoveries in the entire manuscript. The artist clearly understood how real plants were drawn. The proportions were careful. The details were deliberate. The roots even showed signs of age and decay. This wasn't the work of someone who couldn't draw. It looked like the work of someone who was intentionally changing reality. But why? One theory suggested the plants were disguised on purpose. Imagine you're a medieval physician. You discover a valuable medicine. Would you write the recipe where anyone could steal it? Or would you hide it, changing just enough details so only your students could understand? Some historians believe that's exactly what happened. The manuscript may have been a secret medical guide. The real plants were disguised. The names were encrypted. Knowledge was protected. It sounds convincing, until one simple question appears. If the goal was secrecy, why create hundreds of unique illustrations? Wouldn't that require even more work? Again, the theory solved one mystery, only to create another. Then researchers turned another page, and the mystery became even stranger. Women. Dozens of them, some standing, some floating, some climbing through green pools connected by winding tubes. None of it made immediate sense. For years, people assumed the images were symbolic. But symbolic of what? Medicine? Childbirth? Astronomy? Religion? Alchemy? No one could agree. The women weren't drawn like queens, or saints, or mythological figures. Instead, they looked ordinary, almost anonymous, as though the artist wanted the viewer to focus, not on who they were, but on what they were doing. Many appeared to move through water. Others pointed toward stars. Several stood beside strange containers. The scenes felt connected, almost like pages from a forgotten instruction manual. But a manual explaining what? No answer survived. Then came the circular diagrams. Some filled with stars. Others divided into strange geometric sections. One looked almost like a medieval map. Another resembled a machine, or perhaps a calendar. No one could tell. Every chapter seemed to belong to a different subject: botany, astronomy, biology, medicine, geography. Yet, somehow, they all felt connected, as if every page belonged to one enormous idea that only the author understood, and perhaps that was the cruelest part of the mystery. Because the manuscript never looked random. It looked organized, logical, purposeful. It behaved like a book that wanted to teach something. We just didn't know what. For centuries, people believed the greatest mystery was the language. But now, some researchers began asking a different question. What if we've been solving the wrong mystery all along? Maybe. The words were never the key. Maybe the pictures were, by now. The Voynich Manuscript had become famous, not because anyone understood it, but because everyone wanted to be the person who finally did. Over the last 100 years, dozens of researchers have stepped forward with the same claim. I've solved it. For a few weeks, or sometimes a few months, the world paid attention. Newspapers published headlines, interviews were given, books were written, and then the same thing happened. Other experts checked the evidence. The translation failed, again and again and again. One researcher claimed the manuscript was written in medieval Hebrew. Another believed it hid an ancient form of Turkish. Others proposed Latin abbreviations, Chinese, Nahuatl, even an entirely invented language. Each theory looked convincing, until someone asked a simple question. If this translation is correct, why doesn't it explain the entire book? A real solution shouldn't decode one page and fail on the next. It shouldn't explain the plants while ignoring the stars, or explain the stars while ignoring the language. The correct answer has to unlock everything. So far, none has. Then came the people with the strongest reputation of all, the codebreakers. These weren't historians. They weren't language experts. They were professionals who had spent their lives breaking encrypted messages. Some had worked during wars. They had cracked military ciphers that governments believed were impossible to read. If anyone could solve the manuscript, it should have been them. They searched for hidden patterns, repeated structures, mathematical relationships, invisible rules. For months, nothing. Years, nothing. The manuscript refused to behave like any known cipher. It wasn't random enough. It wasn't predictable enough. It was trapped somewhere in between. One codebreaker later admitted something remarkable. He said, "This is one of the most stubborn texts I've ever encountered." Imagine hearing that from someone whose career was breaking impossible codes. Then the computers arrived. What took humans months, machines could do in minutes. Millions of comparisons, thousands of statistical models, pattern recognition beyond anything previous generations could imagine. For the first time, researchers wondered if computers would succeed where humans had failed. The results were fascinating. Some algorithms suggested the manuscript behaved like a real language. Others suggested it behaved like carefully constructed nonsense. Artificial intelligence entered the investigation. It detected structures, clusters, relationships between symbols. But AI had the same problem humans did. It could recognize patterns. It couldn't prove meaning. Knowing two symbols appear together isn't the same as knowing what they mean. And so, even with modern technology, the mystery survived. Perhaps that's the strangest part of all. Humanity has landed on the moon, mapped the human genome, built machines that can learn. Yet one medieval book still refuses to introduce itself. After more than 600 years, the Voynich Manuscript has outlived kingdoms. Empires have risen and fallen. Wars have begun and ended. Entire languages have disappeared. Yet, somehow, this single book survived them all. Not hidden beneath the ground, not locked inside a forgotten cave. It survived in plain sight, passed from one owner to another, resting quietly on library shelves, as if it knew. Its greatest protection wasn't a lock. It was its silence. Today, the manuscript rests inside Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, behind carefully controlled glass, protected from light, humidity, and time itself. Thousands of visitors pass by every year. Most stop for only a moment. They see strange drawings, unknown writing, take one last look. Then continue walking, almost no one realizes. They're looking at one of the greatest unsolved mysteries ever preserved on paper. Maybe one day, someone will notice a pattern everyone else ignored.